Okie Hmm. Welcome, one and all, to Karl Marx Capital, Volume 1, the 2024 edition. We're up to this chapter. We're almost to the end, surprisingly, for better or worse, and we'll see how far we get today. Additionally, this coming week, I'll be working from a new set of notes or discussing a new set of notes for Volume 1. And it's actually kind of an interesting set of notes. And, well, interesting to me, maybe not interesting to anyone else. All righty, then. Let's get on with it. I haven't included this week on this page a video of chapter 24, alias chapter whatever. But well, 26. But we'll get to that. I'll put that in after I finish. Later on this afternoon, following my yammering here, Star Trek: Next Generation. Chapter 24, the so-called original accumulation, on the autonomouscollective.net. The secret of, number one, the secret of original accumulation. We've seen how money is transformed into capital, how capital makes surplus value, and how surplus value makes more capital. The accumulation of capital presupposes surplus value, and surplus value presupposes capitalist production. While capitalist production presupposes that individual commodity producers have large amounts of capital in their hands. The whole process thus seems to imply that capitalist accumulation must be preceded by an original, quote unquote, accumulation, or what Adam Smith calls previous accumulation, an accumulation that doesn't stem from capitalist production, but instead serves as its starting point. This original accumulation plays more or less the same role in political economy as original sin in theology. Adam bit into the apple and the whole human race fell into a state of sin. Similarly, the origin of original accumulation is presented as an anecdote about the past that supposedly explains everything. Long, long ago, there were two kinds of people: elites who showed great industry and ragamuffins who lazed about. The first type of person accumulated wealth, while the second type ultimately came to have nothing to sell but his own skin. Both the poverty of the masses, who still have only themselves to sell in spite of all their labor, and the wealth of the few, which keeps growing even though these few haven't worked in ages, date to this original sin. As a way of defending propriété, Mr. Thiers, for example, feeds this vapid children's tale to the French, who used to have such active and nimble minds, and he does so with the solemnity of a statesman. The moment the question of property is raised, it becomes a sacred duty to insist that the standpoint of nursery tales is the only one appropriate for all ages and levels. It is well known that conquest, subjugation, pillaging, murder, in short, acts of violence have dominated the history of the real world. But the gentle world of political economy has always been an idol. There, law and labor have been the only means of acquiring wealth, although, of course, an exception is made every year for, quote unquote, this year. The methods of original accumulation may be many things. What they are not is idyllic. Money and commodities no more start out as capital than do the means of production or the means of subsistence. They have to be transformed into capital. But this can happen only under certain conditions, namely, two very different commodity owners must come into contact with each other. On the one side is a person who owns money and the means of production and subsistence, and he wants to valorize a sum of value he owns by purchasing someone else's labor power. He encounters the free worker who sells his own labor power and thus sells his labor. This worker is free in two senses. He isn't considered a means of production as slaves and serfs are, nor do the means of production belong to him, as is the case with independent farmers. He is rather free of such things, legally free and property free. Once the commodity market has been polarized in this way, the basic conditions of capitalist production are in place. The capital relation presupposes that workers are separated from the things they need to realize their labor, in the sense that they no longer own those things. As soon as capitalist production has begun to stand on its own 2 feet, it not only maintains this separation, it continuously reproduces it on an ever larger scale. So the process that creates the capital relation must also be the process whereby the worker is split away from owning the prerequisites of his labor, a process that transforms the social means of subsistence and production into capital, while also transforming the actual producers into wage laborers. So-called original accumulation is thus nothing other than the historical process of separating producers from the means of production. It appears as original because it constitutes the prehistory of both capital and the mode of production that goes with capital. Now, we can see right away that this process of separation implies a whole series of historical processes, which is in fact a double-sided series in which two different relations of ownership dissolve. On the one hand, there's the dissolution of the relations that makes workers into another's property, into the means of production that another person appropriates. But what also dissolves is the actual producer's ownership of their means of production. This process of separation encompasses the entire history of the development of modern bourgeois society, and it would be easy to understand if bourgeois historians had shown that as the feudal mode of production dissolved, its mode of exploitation was transformed into the capitalist one, instead of representing feudalism's dissolution exclusively under the clair-obscur of the workers' emancipation. The workers' enslavement was the starting point of this historical development, which moved forward as the form of his enslavement changed. Yet for our purposes, it isn't necessary to analyze that medieval movement. Although capitalist production sporadically took shape in Mediterranean countries as early as the 14th and 15th centuries, the capitalist era dates only to the 16th century. Wherever it blossomed, serfdom had long been abolished, and moreover, the sun had already begun to set on the medieval city-state. The epoch-making moments in the history of this separation process occurred when large numbers of people were violently torn from their means of production and subsistence and thrust, now free as birds and just as rightless, into the labor market as proletarians. The whole process was based on land being expropriated from the workers, which is thus where our analysis will begin. The coloration of this history has varied from country to country and has passed through its different stages in various sequences. Only in England has it assumed its classic form. Hence, England will serve as our example here. The expropriation of the rural population's land. Serfdom had, in effect, disappeared in England by the end of the 14th century. At that time, and even more so in the 15th century, the vast majority of the population was made up of free peasant proprietors. However much the trappings of feudalism may have obscured their status as owners. On the larger feudal estates, free farmers displaced the old bailiffs, themselves former serfs. Some agricultural wage laborers were peasants who wanted to valorize their leisure time by working on those estates, while others belonged to a small, independent class of actual wage laborers, small in both relative and absolute terms. The members of this class were also free peasant proprietors, practically speaking, since they got wages and were given 4 or more acres of arable land with their cottages. Along with actual peasants, moreover, they enjoyed the use of the common land where their cattle grazed and they could gather their firewood, timber, turf, and so on. Throughout Europe, feudal production was characterized by the fact that the land was divided among as many subfeudatories as possible. The feudal lord's power, like that of every sovereign, rested on not the length of his rent roll, but the number of subjects he had, which in turn depended on the number of free peasant proprietors. While England's land was thus divided into giant baronages after the Norman conquest, with a single baronage often including 900 old Anglo-Saxon lordships, it was also strewn with peasant properties, among which only a few large feudal domains were scattered. These conditions, coupled with the urban efflorescence so characteristic of the 15th century, made for the popular wealth that Chancellor Fortescue depicted with such eloquence in the in the Laudibus Legum Angeli. At the same time, however, they precluded wealth as capital. In his description of England, prefix to Holinshed's Chronicles, Harrison describes how the country was being ruined by the expropriation of small farmers, the expropriation of small farmers. What care our great encroachers? The peasants' homes and the workers' cottages were demolished or left to rot. If, says Harrison, the old records of every manor be sought, it will soon appear that in some one manor 17 or 18 or 20 houses are shrunk, that the number of people supported by the land is much reduced, of cities and towns either utterly decayed or more in a quarter or half diminished, though someone be a little increased here or there, of towns pulled down for sheep walks, and no more but the lordships now standing in them, I could say somewhat, unquote. These old chroniclers always exaggerate when they complain, but they still give us a true sense of what contemporaries made of the revolution and the relations of production. Comparing the works of Chancellor Fortescue with Thomas More's allows us to see the gap separating the 15th and 16th century. Without going through any transitional stages at all, members of the English working class tumbled from their golden age, as Thornton observed, into an iron age. Legislation recoiled in the face of this upheaval, having not yet reached that advanced stage of culture where the ultima thule of all statecraft is the wealth of nations, i.e., the formation of capital, and the ruthless exploitation and immiseration of most people. In his History of Henry VII, Bacon writes, at that time, 1489, complaints about the conversion of arable land into pasture, sheep walks, etc., maintained by a few herdsmen began to be more frequent, and tenancies for years, lives, and at will, whereupon much of the yeomanry lived, were turned into demesnes. That bred a decay of people and by consequence a decay of towns, churches, tithes, and the like. In remedying of this inconvenience, the king's wisdom was admirable, and the parliaments at that time. They took a course to take away depopulating enclosures and depopulating pasturage, unquote. An act of Henry VII, 1488, made it illegal to destroy all peasant homes to which more than 20 acres of land were attached. This law was renewed by an act of Henry VIII, which says, among other things, many farms, quote, many farms and great plenty of cattle, particularly sheep, had been gathered into few hands, whereby the rents of the lands had been increased and tillage very much decayed, churches and houses pulled down, and a marvelous numbers of people rendered incapable of maintaining themselves and their families, unquote. Hence, the act prescribed that the dilapidated farmhouses be rebuilt and that also established limits for the ratio of land devoted to sheep pastures and land devoted to wheat fields. An act promulgated in 1533 lamented that some men owned as many as 24,000 sheep and set the maximum limit at 2,000. But the people's expressions of discontent and the long legislative campaign against the expropriation of small farmers and peasants, begun in the day of Henry VII and waged continuously for 150 years, proved equally ineffectual. Without realizing it, Bacon divulged the secret of this failure. Quote, the device of King Henry VII, he says in section 20 of his essay, Civil and Moral, was profound and admirable. in making farms and houses of husbandry of a standard, that is, maintained with such a proportion of land to them as may breed a subject in convenient plenty and no servile condition, and to keep the plough in the hands of the owners and not hirelings. What capitalist production required was just the opposite, that the majority of the people exist in a servile state, that these people be transformed into mercenaries, and that their means of labor be transformed into capital. The older legislation also tried to keep 4 acres of land attached to the rural wage laborer's cottage, and it forbade him from taking in lodgers. As late as 1627, under Charles I, Roger Crocker of Front Mill was punished because he built a cottage on Front Mill Manor, but didn't include 4 acres of land as a permanent annex. And as late as 1638, again under Charles I, a royal commission was appointed to enforce the old laws, especially the one about the 4 acres. This effort persisted into Cromwell's day. He made it illegal to build a house inside a 10-mile radius of London without attaching 4 acres of land to it. Even during the first half of the 18th century, people protested when a rural worker's cottage didn't come with 1 to 2 acres. Nowadays, such a worker wouldn't dare of dreaming of having that much. If his cottage has a little garden or he can rent a few roods of land some distance from it, he considers himself lucky. Quote, landlords and farmers, says Dr. Hunter, work hand in hand here. A few acres to the cottage would make the laborers too independent, unquote. In the 16th century, a frightful new impetus to violently expropriate the people arose as a result of the Reformation and the colossal theft of church property it set in motion. When the Reformation began, the Catholic Church was the feudal owner of much of England's land. The shuttering of monasteries sent their former inhabitants hurtling into the ranks of the proletariat. Church estates were, for the most part, either given away to rapacious royal favorites or sold at laughable prices to speculating farmers and townspeople who drove off large numbers of hereditary subtenants, then consolidated their holdings. By law, the rural poor had been guaranteed ownership of a part of the church's tithes. This was now taken from them without another word. Pauper ubique jacet, exclaimed Queen Elizabeth after traveling around England. In the 43rd year of her reign, the government was finally forced to acknowledge pauperism, which it did when it introduced the poor rate. The authors of this law seem to be ashamed to state the grounds of it, for, contrary to all tradition, it has no preamble whatever. Charles I later made the poor rate permanent, and in fact, it didn't change or become even harsher until 1834. But these immediate effects of the Reformation weren't the most lasting ones. Church property had functioned as the religious bulwark of the old relations of landed property. Its demise rendered them untenable. During the last decades of the 17th century, the yeomen, a class of independent peasants, still outnumbered farmers. The yeomen had been Cromwell's greatest strength, and as Macaulay allowed, it spoke well of them that they were nothing like the dissolute, drunken squires and their lackeys, the county clergy who had to marry their masters' discarded mistresses. Even the rural wage laborers were still part owners of the communal property. But by 1750 the yeomen had disappeared. In the final decades of the 18th century, the last traces of communal agricultural property vanished too. Here we will set aside the purely economic factors that helped bring about the agricultural revolution and focus on the violent measures involved. During the time of the Stuarts' restoration, English landed proprietors used the law to push through a usurpation campaign that was carried out all over the continent too, but without the same legal formality. They abolished the feudal tenure of land, that is, did away with all its obligations to the state. They indemnified the state by imposing taxes on the peasants and the rest of the people. They also established the rights of modern private ownership for estates to which they had only a feudal title. And finally, they enacted those laws of settlement that affected the English agricultural worker in the same way, mutatis mutandis, as the edict of the Tartar Boris Godunov affected the Russian peasants. The Glorious Revolution resulted in the reign of not only William III, but also landed and capitalist profiteers, who inaugurated the new era by stealing state lands on a massive scale. Such theft had been carried out with a certain restraint up to then. These lands were sold at ridiculous prices, simply given away or directly usurped and annexed by private estates. As all this occurred, legal etiquette was completely ignored. The state lands fraudulently appropriated in this way, along with those plundered church estates that weren't lost during the Republican Revolution, eventually became the princely domains of today's English oligarchy. Bourgeois capitalists tried to facilitate this operation, their aims being to transform the land into a purely commercial article, to increase their supply of uprooted proletarians from the countryside who had no rights, and so on. They furthered their own interests just as sensibly as the Swedish urban burghers did when they teamed up with the peasantry, their economic bulwark, to help the king forcibly take back royal lands from the oligarchy. Later, 1604, and also later, or under Charles X and Charles XI. Communal property was an old Germanic institution that had lived on under the cover of feudalism. We've seen that this land began to be violently usurped at the end of the 15th century, continuing into the 16th century, most of the time involving the transformation of cultivated lands into cattle pastures. But back then, expropriation meant individual acts of violence, which a legislative campaign that went on for 150 years tried in vain to stop. The fact that the law itself now functioned as the way to steal the people's land showed the advances made in the 18th century, although big farmers also employed their own little private methods on the side. The parliamentary form of theft was the Bill of Enclosures of Commons, or in other words, decrees the landlords used to turn the people's property into their own private property, to expropriate the people. When Sir Frederick Morton Eden demanded a general act of Parliament for the enclosure of commons, thereby conceding that a parliamentary coup d'etat would be required to transform them into private property, and at the same time called for the legislature to indemnify the expropriated poor, he was in effect refuting his own clever lawyerly claim that communal property was the private property of the large landlords who had supplanted the feudal lords. As tenants at will, that is, small farmers on yearly leases or a servile rabble dependent on the arbitrary will of the landlords, took the place of the independent yeoman, not only the theft of the state domains, but also and especially the systematic theft of communal property did a great deal to help enlarge the big farms that were called capital farms or merchant farms in the 18th century, and moreover, set the agricultural population free for industry, i.e., turned it into a proletariat. However, people didn't understand the identity of a nation and its citizens' poverty in the 18th century as well as they would in the 19th century. Hence the heated polemics in the economic literature of the time having to do with the enclosure of the commons. I will quote just a few passages from the mass of material in front of me, since they will give readers a sense of the circumstances in question. In many parishes of Hertfordshire, wrote one outraged person, 24 farms with an average area of 50 to 150 acres has been combined into 3 farms in Hertfordshire and Leicestershire. Enclosing has greatly prevailed, and most of the new enclosed lordships have turned into pasturage, in consequence of which many lordships have not now 50 acres plowed yearly, in which 1,500 were plowed formerly. The ruin of former dwelling houses, barns, stables, and so on show everyone who passes through that there have been once better inhabitants. 100 houses and families have in some places been reduced to 8 or 10. The landholders in most parishes that have been enclosed only 15 or 20 years are very few in comparison to the numbers who occupied them in their open field state. It is no uncommon thing to see 4 of 5 wealthy graziers engrossing a large enclosed lordship, which was before in the hands of 20 or 30 farmers and as many smaller tenants and proprietors. All these are thereby thrown out of their livings with their families and many other families which were employed and supported by them. But it wasn't only uncultivated land that was annexed by neighboring landowners under the pretext of enclosure. The same thing happened with land that was still being cultivated either communally or by someone who paid the community rent. I have here, in view of enclosures of open fields and lands already improved, it is acknowledged by even the writers in defense of enclosures that these diminish tillage, increase the monopolies of farms, raise the prices of provisions, and produce depopulation. And even the enclosures of wastelands, as currently practiced, bear hard on the poor by depriving them of a part of their subsistence and only go toward increasing farms already too large. If, says Dr. Price, quote, this land gets into the hands of a few great farmers, the consequence must be that the little farmers, who he earlier described as a multitude of little proprietors and tenants who maintain themselves and their families by the produce of the ground they occupy, by sheep kept on a common, by poultry, hogs, etc., and who, therefore, have little occasion to purchase any of the means of subsistence, will be converted, that the little farmers will be converted into a body of men who earn their subsistence by working for others, and who will be under a necessity of going to market for all they want. There will perhaps be more labor because there will be more compulsion to it. Towns and manufacturers will increase because more will be driven to them in quest of places and employment. This is the way in which the engrossing of farms naturally operates. And this is the way in which, for many years, it has actually been operating in this kingdom. Price sums up the overall impact of the enclosures as follows. Upon the whole, the circumstances of the lower ranks of men are altered in almost every respect for the worse. From little occupiers of land, they are reduced to the state of day laborers and hirelings, and at the same time their subsistence in that state is become more difficult. In fact, the usurping of common lands, together with the agricultural revolution that went along with that, affected agricultural workers so drastically that between 1765 and 1780, their wages began to drop below the minimum level, even in Eden's account, and they had to be supplemented with official poor law relief. Their wages, he says, no longer sufficed for the absolute necessities of life. Let's take a moment to listen to someone who defended the enclosures and opposed Dr. Price's position. It would be wrong to conclude that because men are not seen wasting their labor in the open field, depopulation is occurring. If there are fewer people in the countryside, there are all the more people in the towns. If more labor is set in motion when the small farmers are converted into a body of men who must work for others, it is an advantage which the nation, to which naturally these people have been transformed, don't belong, should wish for. The product is greater when their combined labor is applied on one farm. In this way, surplus product is formed for manufacturers, and in turn, the manufacturers, one of the minds of this nation, will increase in proportion to the quantity of the corn produced, unquote. The most brazen transgressions against the sacred rights of property and the basest acts of violence against human beings were required to lay the foundation for the capitalist mode of production. And insofar as they were committed in the service of that end, the political economist accepted them with a stoic peace of mind. Witness Sir Eden, who, moreover, was Tory and philanthropic in his political leanings. What did he conclude about the acts of theft, all the atrocities and cruelty that attended the violent expropriation of the people, a process that began around 1470 and lasted until the final decades of the 18th century? He merely offered the comfortable parting reflection, quote, the due proportion between arable land and pasture had to be established. During all of the 14th and most of the 15th century, there was 1 acre of pasture to 2, 3, and even 4 acres of arable land. Around the middle of the 16th century, the proportion was changed to 2 acres of pasture for every 2 of arable land, and then 2 acres to 1, until finally the just correct proportion of 3 acres of pasture to 1 of arable land was attained. By the 19th century, of course, people no longer even remembered the agricultural workers' tithes to communal property, to say nothing of more recent times. Has the agricultural population been compensated with so much as a farthing for the 3,511,770 acres stolen from it between 1801 and 1831, and thanks to Parliament's maneuvering, gifted to landlords by landlords? Finally, the great process whereby the land was expropriated from the agricultural population was the so-called clearing of estates, i.e., human beings were swept off them. All the English methods we've examined so far culminated in clearing. As we saw in the account of modern conditions given in an earlier section, this clearing was extended to the cottages once there were no more independent peasants to be pushed out. Thus it happened that on the very soil they cultivated, workers couldn't even find the space they needed for their own housing. But what really diminished the actual clearing of estates was its more systematic character, the massive scale on which single operations took place. In Scotland, they were executed in areas as large as some German principalities, and also the peculiar form of property that was so violently made into modern private property. This property belonged to the clan, but the chief or great man, as the clan's representative, only the titular owner, just as the Queen of England is merely the titular owner of her country's land. This revolution began in Scotland after the Pretender's followers rose up for the last time, and we can trace its first phases in the works of James Stewart and James Anderson. In the 18th century, the Scots were driven off the land, but not allowed to emigrate, which forced them to resettle in Glasgow and other factory towns. The clearings ordered by the Duchess of Sutherland should suffice to evoke the main method for expropriating people here. She was well versed in political economy, and upon assuming power, she resolved to try a radical economic cure. Her plan was to transform the whole county of Sutherland into sheep pastures. Because similar measures had already been employed, its population was down to 15,000 people. Then, from 1811 to 1820, these 15,000 inhabitants, or about 3,000 families, were methodically uprooted and driven out. Their villages were razed and torched, their fields turned into pastures. It fell to British soldiers to carry out the operation, and in doing so, they fought with the locals. One old woman burned to death in the hut she had refused to leave. In this way, Madame Sutherland came to appropriate 794,000 acres of land that had belonged to a clan since time immemorial. She allotted the people who had lived there about 6,000 acres on the seashore, or 2 acres per family, and this land that hadn't ever been cultivated or produced any income. So high-minded was the Duchess that she leased the land to the members of the clan at an average price of 2 shillings and 6 pence per acre, these being people who for centuries had shed their blood for her family. She divided the entire mass of the land she had stolen into 29 large sheep farms, each inhabited by a single family, most often the family of an English farm servant. By 1825, all 15,000 Scots had been replaced by 131,000 sheep. The Aboriginal Scots who wound up on the seashore turned to fishing to support themselves. They became amphibians and lived, as an English writer has said, half on land and half in the water, and yet they could live only halfway from both livelihoods. But the loyal Scots had to pay even more dearly for their Highlanders' romantic tendency to idolize the great men in their clan. For when those men smelled the scent of fish, they detected something profitable. They leased the land on the shore to large fishmongers from London, and the Scots were driven away from this place too. In the end, part of their former land was transformed again, this time into a hunting preserve. Everyone knows that England has no real forests. In the parks of the rich, the wild beasts are tame domesticated cattle and as fat as a London alderman. Scotland is thus the last refuge of the quote-unquote noble passion. In the Highland reported summers in 1848, quote, new forests are rising up like mushrooms. Here, on one side of Gaelic, you have the new forest of Glenfishie, and there, on the other side, you have the new forest of Adverachy. In the same line, you have the Black Mount, an immense waste also recently erected. From east to west, from the neighborhood of Aberdeen to the crags of Oban, you have now a continuous line of forests, while in other parts of the Highlands there are the new forests of Loch Arg, Glengarry, Glenmoriston, etc. Sheep were introduced into glens, which had been the seats of communities of small farmers, and the latter were driven to seek subsistence on coarser and more sterile tracts of soil. Now again, deer are supplanting sheep, and on these are once more dispossessing the small tenants who will necessarily be driven down upon still coarser land and to more grinding penury. Deer forests and the people cannot coexist. One or other of the two must yield. Let the forests be increased in number and extent during the great quarter of a century, as they have been in the last, and the gale will perish from their native soil. The movement among the highland proprietors is partly driven by an ambition. A deer forest is beginning to be considered as a necessary appendage of an estate. Others of a more practical cast follow the deer trade with an eye solely to profit, for it is a fact that a mountain range laid out in a forest is in many cases more profitable to the proprietor than when let as sheep walk. The huntsman who wants a deer forest limits his offers by no other calculation than the extent of his purse. Sufferings have been inflicted in the highlands scarcely less severe than those occasioned by the policy of the Norman kings. Deer have received extended ranges, while men have been hunted within a narrower and still narrower circle. One after one, the liberties of the people have been cloven down. These oppressions are daily on the increase. The clearance and dispersion of the people is pursued by the proprietors as a settled principle, as an agricultural necessity, just as trees and brushwood are cleared from the wastes of America or Australia, and the operation goes on in a quiet, businesslike way, etc. Unquote. Stealing church estates, fraudulently claiming and snatching up state lands, seizing communal property, using the most ruthless terror tactics to usurp feudal and clan property and transform it into modern private property. These are some of the idyllic methods of original accumulation. This is how fields were conquered for capitalist agriculture. The land was incorporated into capital, and urban industry got its necessary supply of uprooted proletarians without rights. Section 3, bloody legislation against the expropriated. Since the end of the 15th century, legislation enacted to lower wages. The proletariat that formed when the bands of feudal retainers were dissolved and the land was violently expropriated from the people in concentrated bursts couldn't be absorbed by the early manufacturing system as rapidly as its members were brought into the world. Free as birds and just as rightless, these proletarians also couldn't suddenly learn the kind of discipline their new situation demanded, having been brutally thrown from the work path to which they were accustomed. Large numbers of them became beggars, thieves, and vagabonds. Personal inclination sometimes played a role here, but most often it was external conditions that forced them to live this way. Hence, bloody legislation against vagabonds was enforced throughout Western Europe at the end of the 15th century and during the entire 16th century. The fathers of today's working class were punished because others turned them into vagabonds and paupers. In fact, the law treated them as quote-unquote voluntary criminals, assuming that whether or not they continued to work under old circumstances that no longer existed was a matter of preference. In England, this legislation began under Henry VII. Henry VIII, 1530, old beggars and those unfit to work will receive a beggar's license. Healthy vagabonds, on the other hand, are to be whipped and locked up. They are to be tied to the cart tail and flogged until they are covered in blood. Then they must promise to return to their birthplace, or wherever it is they've spent the last 3 years, and, quote, put themselves to labor, unquote. What a gruesome irony. With Henry VIII, this statute is repeated, except that new clauses make it even harsher. If someone is again caught living as a vagabond, he is to be whipped a second time and half an ear will be cut off. If that person relapses once more, he is to be executed as a hardened criminal, an enemy of the community. Edward VI, according to a statute enacted in 1547, the first year of his reign, anyone who refuses to work is condemned to become the slave of the person who denounced him as an idler. The master must give the slave bread and water, weak broth, and whatever amount of meat scraps he deems appropriate. He has the right to use a whip or chains to force the slave to perform any task, no matter how repulsive. If the slave remains absent for a fortnight, he is condemned to lifelong slavery, and the letter S is branded on his cheek or forehead. The third time he runs away, he is to be executed as a felon. The master may sell, bequeath, or rent out his slave just like any piece of portable property or cattle. If the slave tries to undermine his master in any way, here, too, he is to be executed. Justices of the peace are to use informants to track down the culprit. If it happens that a vagabond has been idling about for 3 days, he is to be brought to his place of birth. The mark V is to be branded on his chest with a red-hot iron, and he is made to work on the roads or perform some other service wearing chains. If he gives a false birthplace, he becomes the lifelong slave of that place, its inhabitants, or its corporation, and the letter S is to be branded on him. All people have the right to take away vagabonds' children and keep them as apprentices. Boys can be kept until they turn 24, girls until they turn 20. If these children run away, they become the master's slaves until they reach those ages, and the masters are free to whip them and put them in chains as they see fit. Every master may clamp an iron ring around a slave's neck, arm, or leg in order to recognize him better. The last part of this statute provides that certain poor persons may be employed by a place or individuals willing to feed them and find them work. This kind of parish slave, he was called a roundsman, existed in England well into the 19th century. Elizabeth, 1572. Beggars older than 14 without a license are to be flogged hard and branded on their right earlobe unless someone wants to put them to work for a year. If they're caught again when they are older than 18, they are to be executed unless someone wants to put them to work for 2 years. If there is another relapse, they are to be shown no mercy and executed as felons. Similar statutes, 18 Elizabeth, about 3, approximately 3, and 1597, James I. A person who wanders about and begs is declared a rogue and vagabond. Justices of the peace in petty sessions are authorized to have such persons publicly whipped and locked up for 6 months. If they're caught in the act a second time, they can be sentenced to spend 2 years in prison. During this time, they are to be whipped at the discretion of the justices of the peace. Dangerous and incorrigible rogues are to be branded with the letter R on their left shoulder and given hard labor. If they are caught begging again, they are to be shown no mercy. They are to be executed without clergy present. These statutes remained in effect until the beginning of the 18th century and were not abolished until 1223 was enacted. France had similar laws. By the middle of the 18th century, a vagabond, truand, kingdom had been established in Paris, and at the beginning of Louis XVI's reign, Ordinance of July 1777, healthy persons between 16 and 60 years of age were still to be sent to the galleys if they practiced no profession and had no means of supporting themselves. Elsewhere, too, we find the same kind of laws. For example, Charles V's Statute of October 1531 in the Netherlands, the First Edict of States and Town in Holland, enacted in March 1614, and the Plakat of the United Provinces of 1649. The people in the countryside were thus violently expropriated and driven from the land, turned into vagabonds, and then whipped, branded, and tortured in accordance with grotesquely cruel laws until they acquired the discipline that the system of wage labor demands. It wasn't enough that the things workers needed in order to work and the things they worked with were gathered as capital on one side of the capital relation, while people who had only their own labor power to sell appeared on the other side. It wasn't enough to force those people to voluntarily sell themselves. What developed as capitalist production advanced was a working class whose members saw the demands of that mode of production as self-evident natural laws, having been brought up to do so and also owing to tradition and habituation. Once the capitalist production process had become highly organized, it broke all the resistance it encountered. The continuous generation of relative surplus population that kept the law of labor supply and demand, and thus wages, on track that fit with capital's valorization requirements, and the silent force of economic relations sealed the capitalist domination over its workers. Direct extra economic violence is still used, of course, but only in exceptional cases. For the most part, the capitalist can entrust the worker to the natural laws of production, i.e., count on the fact that the worker is dependent on capital, something that arises from the conditions of production themselves and is guaranteed and perpetuated by them. Not so during the historical genesis of capitalist production. The ascendant bourgeoisie had to employ state power in order to regulate wages or impose limits on wages consonant with profit making, extend the workday, and keep workers at their normal level of dependence. This represents an essential moment in so-called original accumulation. The class of wage laborers, which emerged in the last half of the 14th century, amounted early on to only a very small group within the overall population, remaining so throughout the next century. It enjoyed strong protection with respect to the position it occupied. Independent peasant proprietors gave it that in the countryside, and guild organizations did the same in towns. In both places, masters and workers existed in close proximity in a social sense. Labor was subordinated to capital, but only formally. The mode of production didn't yet have a specifically capitalist character. Capital's variable component far exceeded its constant part, and thus the demand for wage labor grew rapidly every time capital accumulated, while the supply lagged behind. The large part of the national product that would be turned into capital's accumulation fund still went into the workers' consumption fund. From the start, the laws regulating wage labor were written to exploit the worker, and as new ones were created, they never became any less hostile to him. The first to be enacted was Edward III's Statute of Labors, 1349. It had its French counterpart in the Ordinance of 1350, which was promulgated in the name of King John. English and French legislation developed along parallel paths and featured the same basic content. I won't address the statute's attempts to extend the workday since I've already examined that point in Chapter 8. The Statute of Laborers was passed in response to an urgent plea from the House of Commons. Formerly, as one Tory naively put it, the poor demanded such high wages as to threaten industry and wealth. Now their wages are so low as to threaten industry and wealth equally and perhaps more, but in another way, unquote. The law established a wage tariff for the city and the countryside, and for both piecework and day labor. Rural workers were to hire themselves out by the year. In the towns, workers were to hire themselves out on the quote-unquote open market. Paying a wage higher than the one set by the statute was punishable by prison. Accepting such a wage carried even stiffer penalties. According to sections 18 and 19 of Elizabeth's statutes of apprentices, a person who paid too much was to spend 10 days in prison, while someone who received too much in wages was to spend 21 days there. A statute of 1360 made the penalties more severe, even authorizing masters to employ corporal punishment to compel workers to work for the legal wage. All the contracts, oaths, and organizations used by masons and carpenters to codify their loyalty to one another were declared null and void. To form a workers' coalition was now a serious crime, and this held from the 14th century until 1825, the year when the anti-coalitions laws were repealed. The true spirit of the Statute of Laborers of 1349 and later versions shone forth where the law took care to set a maximum for wages, but didn't bother at all about a minimum. As readers know, the workers' situation worsened dramatically in the 16th century. Monetary wages rose, but not in proportion to money's depreciation and the corresponding rise in commodity prices. Thus, real wages fell. Yet the laws enacted to lower wages remained in place, as did the practices of branding and clipping the ears of those whom no one was willing to take into service. The Statute of Apprentices authorized justices of the peace to fix certain wages and modify them according to the season and commodity prices. James I extended these labor regulations to weavers, spinners, and every other category of worker. George II extended the laws against workers' coalitions to all manufacturing workshops. In the manufacturing period proper, the capitalist mode of production became so powerful that the laws regulating wages were rendered unenforceable and unnecessary in equal measure. There remained, however, a desire to keep the old legislative arsenal around just in case, hence a statute enacted as late as George III prohibited journeymen tailors in and around London from receiving a daily wage higher than 2 shillings 7.5 pence, except in times of general mourning. Hence, too, a statute enacted as late as George III, 13 George III, and entrusted justices of the peace with regulating silk workers' wages as late as 1796. Two judgments from the High Court were needed to determine whether the orders of justices of the peace regarding wages were also valid for non-agricultural workers. In 1799, Parliament confirmed that miners' wages in Scotland were still regulated by an Elizabethan statute and two 17th century Scottish acts, one dating to 1661 and the other to 1617. An unheard of event in England's House of Commons showed how dramatically circumstances had changed in the meantime. For more than 400 years, this institution had produced only wage laws that set strict maximum limits. But in 1796, Whitbread proposed to establish a legal minimum wage for agricultural workers. Although Pitt argued against this, he allowed that the, quote, condition of the poor was cruel, unquote. It wasn't until 1813 that the laws regulating wages were finally repealed. They became laughably irrelevant as soon as capitalists began using private legislation to regulate their factories while letting the poor rate supplement the wages of agricultural workers to the point where workers receive the indispensable minimum. Still in effect today are the provisions of the workers' statutes about giving notice and the like, whereby a master who breaks his contract faces only civil penalties, while a worker who does that faces criminal charges. In 1825, however, the horrific laws against workers' coalitions were abolished in the face of the proletariat's menacing attitude. Parliament didn't want to see them go, of course, this being the same Parliament that for centuries had displayed the most cynical shamelessness in functioning as a permanent coalition of capitalists allied against workers. After the storm of revolution had broken out, the French bourgeoisie dared to take away the workers' freshly won right of association. A decree of June 1791 pronounced workers' coalitions, quote, an assault on liberty and on the Declaration of the Rights of Man, unquote. A person who helped form one was to be fined 500 livres and stripped of the rights of an active citizen for a year. This law leveraged the power of the state to force the struggle between labor and capital within limits that made it much more comfortable for the latter of the two. And the law would survive revolutions and dynastic change. In fact, it was removed from the French Penal Code only quite recently. Even the Reign of Terror let it stand. Nothing said or done here was more characteristic than the pretext for this bourgeois coup d'etat. Admitting, wrote Le Chapelier, the recorder, quote, only that they should be a little higher than they are at present. Wages must be high enough for the person receiving them to be free from that state of absolute dependence produced by deprivation of the necessities of life, and which is almost that of slavery, unquote. Workers must not be allowed to communicate about their interests, act collectively, and thereby reduce their, quote, absolute dependence, unquote, which is almost that of slavery, unquote. Of course, if they did so, they would compromise the liberty of their, quote, the liberty of their former masters, who are their present entrepreneurs, unquote. In other words, the former masters' freedom to keep enslaving their workers would be compromised, and forming a coalition against the despotism of people who had been the masters in corporate society would mean, try to guess, recreating the old corporations that the French Constitution had just abolished. I'm going to stop here because I'm past my time, and we have plenty more to read and in discussing the rise of capitalism and the presuppositions of capitalist accumulation. But I think you see where Marx is going. I may close with a few of the editor's notes, which are actually considerable for this chapter. And then we'll let you go back to our original programming, which will be Star Trek: The Next Generation at the top of the next hour. As you can see, there are plenty of notes that footnotes that Marx put in. Actually, it's endnotes. Chapter 24, the so-called original accumulation. Lowercase Roman numeral 1, editor's notes. The original accumulation is sometimes translated into English as primitive accumulation, but primitive is a strong and unnecessary interpretation of the German or, which indicates the earliest protoform of something without implying a simpler or less sophisticated thing. Accumulation is original when value is extracted from people in the earth without recompense, equivalent to theft or pillage, though it goes by more pleasant names. It is a first accumulation without precedent or contract, as well as the origin of all future accumulation. In this section, Marx makes the critical distinction between what he sees as the essential mode of accumulation under capital, wage labor, and the many other ways capitalism will have appropriated and expropriated resources in order to establish wage labor as the standard in the first place, while in the process rooting out other social systems in order to come to dominance. For that reason, the section touches on some of the most violent experiences perpetrated by Europe and its satellites on its own populations and land, as well as on other peoples and parts of the planet over the last 500 years. Marx begins by critiquing prior political economists on the topic when he uses the epithet so-called and puts original or ursprünglich in quotation marks. He's referring in the main to Adam Smith, whose account has roots in the political economy of James Stewart, an inquiry into the principles of political economy of 1767. In the edition Marx owned of Smith's Wealth of Nations, we read, as the accumulation of stock is previously necessary for carrying on this great improvement in the productive powers of labor, so that accumulation naturally leads to this improvement. That's Smith's Wealth of Nations, 1814. Prior to labor becoming productive, accumulation has to happen, and not through production. Nothing is natural about this previous accumulation. Marx retorts, just as nothing is natural about the capitalistic labor relations it makes possible. Nevertheless, Smith is not wrong about the need for previous accumulation, but Smith ignores a number of equally crucial factors. In order for capital processes to get started, a prior accumulation of materials, enough means of production to employ enough laborers is certainly necessary. Beyond that, capitalists also need an accumulation of disposable workers, disposable labor, workers who have been freed from other obligations and made ready for the productive work that is their destiny. Marx makes it clear that a proletariat has to be created. It's not born, but forged by force and discipline to serve its new boss. An ever larger stock of land is also needed, dedicated to producing the food to support the mass of workers who no longer produce their own means of subsistence. This is why it is misleading to translate ursprünglich as primitive. Original accumulation is neither undeveloped nor simple, and its savagery should not be compared to anything other than itself, European legal violence, or ursprüngliche Gewalt, original violence. Original accumulation counts as a leap in Marx's explanations of the capital system's birth. In earlier texts, such as the Communist Manifesto, Marx, with Engels, envisioned a more sequential chain of events, where feudal society gave way almost by fate to industrial society. Industrialized Europe prepared the world for the post-capitalist society to come. Marx began to think through a new account of the capital system's nascency in Value, Price, and Profit, 1865. In those lectures, he said directly what he says here indirectly. Remember, Value, Price, and Profit is more of a pamphlet in that sense, with added quotation marks around the phrase. He wrote that what the economists called, quote, the previous or original accumulation, unquote, should be in fact called original expropriation. Marx's revised concept of ursprüngliche Akkumulation as proletarianization through force has provoked controversy since at least 1913, when Rosa Luxemburg wrote a renowned critique and extension of Marx's theory entitled The Accumulation of Capital. Obviously, original forms of accumulation still occur, and ongoing events of colonization and imperialism, as Luxemburg argues in her book. The capital system cannot exist without inputs continually coming in from the outside, in addition to exploitation within its precincts. Capital continuously ransacks the world around. I'll stop now, finally, and but you can look at this at your leisure. We have the complete text available. Let's see if there are any questions, comments. A worker coalition is an assault on the rights of man. Yes, expropriation shook out with the East India Company too. Well, East India ran under its own, as they say, private rules, and being in far away, and being in some cases the only representation of the crown, you can sort of make up the rules as you go along, which they did. Beggars younger than 14. Let's see, what else? Enemy of the community, indeed. You could say that there's a question on how is this expropriation in Europe reflected in things like manifest destiny in nascent states. Well, that's what churches are for, right? This notion of manifest destiny is expressed, well, it depends on the century, of course, and manifest destiny does have this lengthy, liturgical history. But, the reality is you usually have some sort of institutional force, bolstered in the American context, of course, by journalism, with all due respect. So, you can see how this is promoted forward, let's put it that way. It's clear that, of course, the Mormons from upstate New York are, also believers of this same idea. And yes, there are ragamuffins. Okay, so given that, let me thank you for your attention. And we will resume again with next week with section 5, chapter 24, volume 1, the 2024 edition of Marx's Capital. Thank you very much. I'm now going to stop share and shut off